Welcome everybody to this session. I'm going to introduce Nigel Marriott. I'm Andrew Cockayne. I'm the Managing Director at Captive Health, and I'm really pleased that everybody's joined us for this session. Thank you very much for giving us a chunk of your lunch break. We're going to try and keep this to 45 minutes and definitely finish within the hour if we have an interactive question and answer session, which I hope will be the case. Let me introduce Nigel Marriott. Nigel is a chartered statistician. He's a fellow at the Royal Statistical Society. He and I have worked together for many years, and he is perhaps the most knowledgeable knowledgeable statistician and the best communicator as a data scientist that I've ever met. I wanted to give you the opportunity to join with me and hear from him how to create the perfect survey, be that a staff survey or a patient survey, and we have members of the audience, participants from both camps today. The session will use both examples. So I think that leaves me to hand over to Nigel. Say thank you very much, and just remind you that during the course of the session you can ask questions. Simply type your question into into your control panel, and you can also raise your hand. So if you want to ask questions, raise your hand. We'll stop during the course of the session, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as we go along. So Nigel, we're all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. So as you can see, the title is 6 Steps to a Perfect Survey, and this presentation is basically going to support the 2 handouts that are available for you to download. I'm not going to repeat those handouts word for word, but we're going to use a couple of case studies during this presentation to bring the handout to life and prompt thoughts in your mind as to how you can improve the surveys that you're currently undertaking. I'm going to try and, it's about 15, 16 slides we're going to go through, and I want to try and leave about 15, 20 minutes at the end for questions. But if there's anything, clarification you need of a particular slide as I'm going through, then by all means, put the question up and I'll do my best to answer that. So if you go to the next slide, please, Andrew. Okay. My background as a statistician means that I've actually undertaken many surveys in a wide range of industries, and it's not just surveys of people, but also surveys of products and assets. And so that allows me to bring in ideas and thoughts and best practice that I've seen in other fields into this presentation. And so this is my summary of what I consider to be a perfect survey, asking the right people in sufficient numbers, the right questions that elicit honest answers that are easily collated and summarized in such a way that actionable insights can be obtained, enabling organizations to make the right decisions. And as you can see, there's a number of steps in that statement, and it all links together. If one of those links breaks, then really your surveys don't just struggle a little bit here. But achieving a perfect survey, however, is actually quite hard because, as I say, it only needs one of the links to actually break. I sort of probably take the Buddhist attitude to this, in that the perfect survey is in nirvana you're trying to achieve, and it's very hard work to get there. All we can really seek to do is get as close as we can. If we can move to the next slide, please, Andrew. So I'm going to use 2 case studies which are both by no means perfect. As I say, these are 2 surveys that I've been involved in terms of the analysis and design, etc. In both cases, I've worked with other consultants in order to deliver. So the hospital trust actually worked with Andrew on this survey, an inpatient survey, and then the probation trust was with another consultant for a staff engagement survey. And we're going to use these 2 surveys to basically bring to life the key element of the 2 papers that are available for download, what I call a survey wheel. And the reason I call it a wheel is that when you come to the design of a survey, it's not a linear step-by-step process, in my opinion, because where you start often depends on the context of why you're doing the survey in the first place. And indeed, we advance to the next slide, Andrew, we'll actually see what was the starting point for these two surveys. So in the case of the inpatient survey, what had happened there is that there had been this monthly tracking of inpatient experience using a survey, a mail-out survey, and that data had originally been collected for benchmarking purposes. But in this particular case, what Andrew and I wanted to do was to see, well, okay, can we also use that same survey to identify what's the key drivers of patient satisfaction and what should the trust be focusing on in order to improve? And so in this particular case, the original objective was something else. The design was all set. We couldn't change that. The data was already in. It was collected, and the summary for that benchmarking study was done. So this put the starting point for this analysis into the insight approach. And therefore, we were trying to say, well, is there more that we can extract from this data? In the case of the probation staff survey, this was a repeat of a survey that they had carried out 2 years previously. So this was much more an objective for saying, well, okay, can we actually say if we've improved? Has staff engagement improved since 2 years, especially in the areas that we prioritise? And also there's an additional element of, well, what should we be focusing on now? So this was more started in the objective scope, but the design was a bit constrained in that they wanted to repeat what had happened 2 years ago. So this wasn't starting from scratch. This was also saying, well, okay, let's use the same design as last time, and that places some constraints on the other scopes. So this is something I explore in more detail in the handouts available. This idea, when you start a survey, where is your actual starting point? It's not always what you consider to be at the beginning, i.e. the objective. Go to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now is to go through each of the 6 posts. I'm going to start with objectives and move around that wheel. Actually, there's one more point I want to make, Andrew. Could I go back to the previous slide? You can see the scopes are coloured. Now, I explore this more in the document, but just briefly, the colours are sort of designed to indicate to what extent you can automate the process. So the work that I consider that you need to undertake in the objective and the design scope, which are the 2 blue scopes, to me just simply cannot be automated. That's that's straight management consulting skills called for facilitation, for elicitation, talking with the end users of the survey, finding out what their objectives are, what their needs are, what their triggers are. You cannot automate that element at all. The orange scope, the design and insight, are analytical. Now, yes, you can use software to do your calculations and that, but you need to know which tool to use, and for that you need expertise. Unless your survey is very simple, you can't really automate these elements. But the field work and the results segment, where we sort of summarise the results and carry out the field work, that's where automation can definitely come in, where we can speed up the process, make it more reliable, quicker, cheaper, etc. So that's the reason for the colour coding. Sorry, Andrew, we'll go back to the next slide now. So on the objective, in my handout that's available, I go through each of these scopes and I list first of all why I consider to be the key questions to answer. In this case, what do I need to know and who do I need to ask? And then list the pitfalls that people can fall into. And here, 2 pitfalls that we often see are imprecise objectives and too many objectives. So let's have a look at the 2 case studies that we were looking at here. So the probation staff survey. Here, the objectives, in my opinion, were fairly well defined. They basically wanted to know, have they improved on, have staff engagement improved, and what did they need to focus on in order to continue improve. They had also identified their priorities. This is something that can often happen, is we have too many objectives. I prefer to see the objectives prioritised. As a statistician, I consider each objective requiring a different survey. In a pure ideal world, every objective would be treated separately and have its own survey. Now, that might be too costly in terms of time and effort. So having said that, however, you can actually get much smaller sample size if you restrict your objective to something very precise. So if you've got a very precise objective, you can actually take a small sample to answer that one, then take another small sample to answer the next one, and so on. So I think this is something that people can make a mistake in trying to have far too many objectives. And as a result, the survey grows and becomes a bit too big. It tries to become all things to all men. Here, in this particular case, they had at the very least agreed their priority areas. However, what was probably an issue with this one is that I don't think enough thought has been given in terms of the key questions, particularly when it came to saying, well, what is the priority in terms of going forward? I didn't think they'd really thought through, well, of the questions, which were the real key questions? In other words, what does success look like? When they say, oh yes, you know, our staff are really engaged, how do they actually know that? What is the key question that really tells them, yes, we've got staff here that are really engaged or they're really disengaged? That, there was some key questions there, but I felt the thought hadn't quite gone into it. Probably the bigger issue, I thought, with the probation staff survey here was the fact that there was a lack of thought regarding potential new issues. They wanted to rerun this survey that had been taken place 2 years ago. So obviously, there's a desire of comparability in order to be able to compare like-for-like questions. But I thought that probably constrained their thinking a little bit, and it probably stopped them thinking, well, actually, what has happened in the last 2 years that we need to be asking about now? So that was one element there with the probation staff. I should say that from my perspective, when I got involved with this survey, we were left with very little time to influence the objective and design phase. And it's something that I've often experienced as a statistician, being called in too late into the process to influence the beginning. The inpatient survey, as I say, was originally designed for benchmarking purposes. It wasn't actually intended as a way of identifying key drivers of improvement. So that, in effect, we were reusing the survey for a new objective for which it hadn't really been designed for. And I put this little line in. It's something that us statisticians like talking about, torturing the data until it confesses. And that happens when you get a data set, you haven't worked out what it means, so well, let's analyze it again, and then let's analyze it. Let's just keep analyzing until we get something that we can use. However, the key questions here were fairly well defined. I felt that there was an overall section at the end of the survey that the trust would feel would represent the overall impression of the inpatient experience. So that's a couple of points there on objectives. If we go to the next slide, please. So let's look at design. This is when we get into a much more statistical element. So obviously it's an area I'm particularly involved in as a statistician. And this is where we get on to questions of what's our sample size, how to select them, do we actually need a questionnaire, and are we going to test the questionnaire process before we actually do it? This business of needing questionnaire, I think in the case of staff engagement and in-patient experience, it's probably fair to say that a survey is 9 times out of 10 the right way of measuring those two examples. But sometimes I think we are a bit too quick to go to a questionnaire as a way of measuring experience. And it may be worth just stopping and thinking, well, is there another way of measuring such things? The obvious one in both of these cases would be complaints and grievances. The number of those, are they going up or down? Now, obviously, it's harder when you've got data like that to be able to say, well, okay, what's driving that? What is the cause of the increase in number of complaints? The survey allows you to look at the key drivers of experience as well as, you know, the overall measure as well. So in these cases, I'm very happy that surveys are being used, but I just want to challenge the idea, the default thinking that we must always be using surveys. Basically, the value of a questionnaire is when we're trying to take measurements of what's inside people's heads. That's what we use a questionnaire for. And if it's outside someone's head, the chances are we can actually measure it some other way. So looking at the two case studies, what went well, what didn't go well? Well, the probation staff in this particular case, they didn't have to ask the question of what the sample size. It was everybody, it was 600 staff across 8 locations. What was interesting, though, was the number of questions, and this is something I see quite often, is when I ask how many questions have you got in the questionnaire, in this case, they claimed there were 47. Well, actually, when you looked into it, it wasn't. There were 108 specific questions that people actually had to answer, because within, say, question 23, there'll be 23A, 23B, 23C, or there might be a pathway dependency. So, did you do this? And yes, no. If no, go to this. And I think people forget to actually count how many boxes people actually have to fill in when they count the number of questions, something I have actually seen. And obviously, you know, 108 questions is huge. You're running the risk of survey fatigue. In this particular case, last time round, they had over 200 questions. So it was a huge questionnaire last time round. And they thought, they patted themselves on the back, they got it down to 108. They did at the very least prioritise 27 questions that was meant to be, were mandatory to be answered. The rest were optional. So that was a good thing. But as I say, we got very little time to check the design. They had designed it themselves, and we had less than a week to review it. And this is where testing is really so useful. In this particular case, it was an electronic questionnaire over the internet. And there was turned out to be an error in this, in that these 27 questions that people were supposed to answer, you could actually bypass that. It was possible to all 27 questions appeared on a single page of the website, and provided you answered at least one of them, you could then proceed to the next phase of the questionnaire. Now, that would have been picked up had we had proper testing. As it was missed, and so there were some people who didn't answer all of the 27 questions. In the end, I think the maximum non-response was 5 out of the 27, so it wasn't too bad. But this was a classic example of the need for testing. And you don't need a lot of people, but I do think it can save so much bother. But 9 times out of 10, people just don't bother with testing. The demographic questions were pretty awful, actually. When it came to asking about ethnicity, I've never seen such a bad one in my life, actually. And the staff quite rightly either refused to answer it or just gave us useless answers. So I'm not going to go into the dirty details on that, but effectively what it did was mix up nationality with ethnicity. Quite bad, actually. There was also an issue with the 27 mandatory question. There was an issue over the tones used. You'll see this in the next slide. The inpatient survey was a random sample, 500 people per month, or rather that was the 500 people that were sent a questionnaire. Of course, not all of them would have responded. 84 questions in total, and all of them were closed. Now, I thought this is something that, with today's technology, we ought to be trying to get out the habit of. A closed question where you've only got a selection of 4 or 5 options to tick. It obviously had the advantage of making it easier to collate the responses, code it up, and process the analysis. It, of course, restricts people's responses. But with advances in text analytics these days, sentiment analysis, and tools that can detect keywords within text, sensitive in that, I think we should be looking to have more and more open questions. You don't need a lot. In the probation staff survey, the last question was open. They were allowed to say what they liked. And that turned out to be very valuable. About 20% of the respondents, no, it was higher than that. It was about 30% of the respondents took advantage of it and took something down. And what was very interesting is that we did a sentiment analysis. We looked at the sentiment that was expressed, and it actually backed up the conclusion that we were drawing from our key drivers analysis. And it was nice to have that confirmation. They've gone through a series of closed questions which were always potentially open to challenge. But then we were able to use the open question to see, well, okay, were our conclusions from our analysis backed up by the sentiment? And the answer it was. And I do think at least trying to have at least one closed open question is something that we should be doing more and more in surveys these days. There was an issue with ordinal scales that were rather unbalanced in this inpatient survey. If we go into the next slide, we'll see some examples of questions. So the probation staff survey were pretty much all the questions were agree to disagree statements. From an analytical perspective, I quite like this way of doing things, but there are good ways and bad ways of doing this. In this particular case, these were, what you see here is 6 of the 27 mandatory questions. And as you can see, if you read them, so to what extent do you agree with the following? I have clear understanding about my role. My work offers me opportunity to use my initiative. Probation trust is a good place to work. I feel valued by the probation trust. I could explain to someone who didn't work here what they're trying to achieve. Now, if you look at the sentiment of those statements, they're all positive. So when you're agreeing with those statements, you're generally indicating satisfaction. Now, all 20 of the 27 statements, 26 were positive statements. But one of them, highlighted in red, was, I worry about work outside my working hours. Now, that's a negative statement. That's a negative sentiment, sorry, there. Now, imagine you're filling this in. You're not going to spend ages on each of these because you know there's 100 questions to do. And what you tend to fall into in response is picking up on the sentiment rather than thinking about the detail too much. And so we could see quite a few people clicking agree, 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 and not reading that question properly, clicking agree, when in fact they almost certainly wanted to say disagree. There was a mental leap required to pick up on the fact that this is actually a negative sentiment. So in this kind of scenario, I think you have 2 options. You either make all these statements the same sentiment, either positive or negative. Now, the risk in that is the potential for subconscious bias. If it's all positive, you are sort of like subliminally encouraging a positive statement. You can still have differentiation, though, between segments in your target population. Alternatively, mix up the sentiment, positive and negative. Now, that will force people to stop and think, and it will take them longer to fill out. Both options are okay, in my opinion. The other thing we did with this, and it's just a minor point, but I actually agreed with this, is that the option was a 5-point scale, but the middle option of neither agree or disagree was not offered. So people were forced to either agree or disagree, known as a fourth choice statement. I think that's an entirely valid way of doing things. And I think, because otherwise you end up with some people taking the easy way out of just picking neither. And you're not really encouraging people to actually express their opinion. So I happen to think that's not a bad idea. With the inpatient survey, we probably had, these are a couple of examples of the questions here. There were two things about this survey that could have been better. Question 75, for example, here, that ordinal scale is rather unbalanced. 3 positive sentiments, 1 sort of neutral, and then 1 negative statement. I don't like that at all. If you can have 3 positive sentiments, have 3 negatives as well. The other one was, I'd like to try and avoid questions having an NA in it. So in question 23, one of the responses there is, I did not use a toilet or bathroom. Well, that's basically NA. Personally, I think that should be split into 2. First question, did you use a toilet or bathroom? No, go to question 4. Yes, go to question 23, and then get the answer. But, it's just a question of questionnaire flow. I prefer to see that split into 2. If we go to the next slide, please. So field work, in the case of the probation staff survey, this was an e-survey, and this was actually the driver of the whole project. In the previous time, it had taken a long time to collect the data, a long time to turn the results around, and they wanted to speed the whole thing up. So a decision was made very early on to use this e-survey tool. But with the sheer number of questions, there was clear evidence of survey fatigue. The non-response definitely increased as they went through the survey. And what was also particularly notable in this case is the demographic and job profile sections at the end were non-response was particularly high. And for us, that indicated lack of confidence in confidentiality. So that was something there that came out fairly strongly, in our opinion. And in practice, there was almost very little data there, but apart from the job role, there was very little data that we could actually use in those 2 sections. So there's obviously a lesson there of how do you actually ensure that staff can feel confident that they're not going to get identified. The inpatient survey was a postal questionnaire run over 10 months, and I believe there was chasing of non-respondents in order to get the response rate up here. So pretty much, I don't really want to say much more here on field work. I'd say for me the main issue here was that you do actually need to get buy-in from people to actually fill out the questionnaire. And I was rather struck by the fact in the probation staff there was an element of distrust for filling in the demographic and job profile section at the end. We can move on to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Nigel. I'm just going to jump in a second, and I'm looking at the control panel. Can I just encourage people to use the option to stick their hand up if they want to ask questions? So we can pause between slides and take any questions on any points of detail. If you want to raise your hand, I'll see that as organizer, and we'll just jump in and take questions. I don't see any hands raised at the moment, so let's move to the next slide and move on.
Okay, yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so in the results section, the results here is the summary, usually the question by question summary. So where you see a table or a chart that indicates how people responded to the questionnaire. It's not the insight. The insight comes from drawing conclusions from the responses. This is just the first step. And in my opinion, good practice here is to present these results, the question by question results, as appendices. And certainly that's what we did with the probation staff report. The inpatient stuff, this has already been done in the benchmarking report. The we had issues with non-response with the probation staff, and that meant we used an imputation model. Now, this is a statistical approach to try and fill in the gaps. It is valid under some circumstances, it's not valid in all circumstances. The main reason for not doing it is if there's no pattern to the non-response. So if you find, for example, the people that are not bothering to respond are those that tend to be dissatisfied, then you've got a pattern there, and you can exploit that pattern with an imputation model. If, on the other hand, those who are satisfied are just as likely not to respond as those who are dissatisfied, then you can actually exclude the people. And that's what happened in the inpatient survey. We generally went for exclusion of non-responders rather than imputation. But in the probation staff work, we felt that there were patterns appearing in responses that could be exploited to estimate what people would have said. And that's what we did there. I just want to pick on a minor point here, weighting. In general, statisticians like results to be weighted to correct the differential non-response, but that's only valid if you have a suitable weighting data set. And here we needed local demographics. Local demographics of patients, not local demographics of the residents. That's quite different things. And there was some difficulty in accessing that here. So our results into the inpatient survey weren't weighted, but we don't think that influenced the result. I'm going to show you a couple of charts that we use here. If we go to the next slide. So I just want to show a couple of ways of presenting the data. In this particular case, the probation staff survey, these are the 27 key questions arranged along the bottom. And the scale on the left here is the agree to disagree scale. And what we did was said, well, let code agree as 1, disagree as -1, tend to agree as half, and tend to disagree as -1/2. And then we take the average of those numerical responses and plot that on this scale for each question. And then show what last year's was. So here we've got a color coding system. The red bars indicate that it's a negative change from 2 years ago. In other words, satisfaction or agreement has actually dipped in those cases. The blue bars indicate that agreement has increased. And here we sorted the results by what they were 2 years ago. So right at the end, equal opportunities. In other words, it is organisation good at equal opportunities. It was rated best last time round. And at the bottom, feeling valued by the organisation was rated worse. And now what quite immediately jumps out from this is that the areas where they did badly last time have actually improved for the most part. And that's come through fairly clearly. However, the areas where they were strong at, there was a small dip. So there might have been an element here of taking their eye off the ball a little bit. And that, to me, comes through fairly strongly from this chart. But if you go to the next slide, we took the same data, but just reorganized the question. This time, the same chart, but we reorganized the questions and grouped it by the theme. So some of these questions relate to my team, some of the questions relate to my manager, to the job, etc. And this brings out a different picture. And the picture that comes out here is that the questions that relate to my team, there are a lot of blue bars there. In other words, improvement. But the questions relating to my job show a lot of small red bars. In other words, a slight dip. So straight away, you've got a thematic analysis coming out to, you know, in these charts here. I see a question coming up here. So if you could move to the next slide, I'm going to answer that question now. Let me just, I'm just going to read the question now, check whether I'll come back to it later. So how would you know, though, the reasons why staff were not responding? I'll come back to that one at the end, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. And please please do everybody use the question boxes there. Let's catch all those questions and we'll have a good session towards the end. So Nigel, if we can have another sort of somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes,
5 minutes.
and then we'll have a good session of Q&A. Do please raise your hands and enter your questions in the question bar. Thank you.
Yeah, okay then. Now, insight. For me, that last chart really shows one of the key ways of delivering insight, and that's the need to think in terms of question themes. I think too often I see analysis getting bogged down into question-by-question analysis. I don't think that's why people respond. As I say, if you give them 108 questions, what they're going to start to respond with is themes. So you might have a bunch of themes in the case of inpatients around doctors and nurses, and the chances are they're going to give roughly similar answers to each question. So that when you get that case, what I like to do is to split the questions into themes, as I've done in both case studies here, and then within each theme, create segments of responses. So you generally find, let's say, a question theme about doctors and nurses, there might be 6 questions. You'll find, well, let's split the respondents into those that are generally satisfied, those that are generally dissatisfied, and those that are generally neutral, and perhaps there'll be another group that are happy with some but dissatisfied with others. That is a very powerful way of looking at it. Now, it requires more sophisticated statistical techniques known as multivariate analysis, but if you can carry that out and get those segments, you will then have a much greater insight. And this is then what we did in both of these cases. If we go to the next slide, please, Andrew, I'm going to show you a couple of outputs from this analysis. Here, for the probation survey, the themes are shown along the bottom. And within each theme, we have generally had between 3 and 6 segments, typically 4 and 5, roughly correlating with levels of satisfaction. And then there was this overall theme, which is what is measured on the left-hand scale. So the dashed red line showed that about 45% of staff were in the most satisfied segment of when we look at the overall theme. By the next year, it's gone up to 54%. So this has shown an overall improvement. Which of the themes along the bottom had the biggest impact on that? And what we did was, the analysis is shown here. What we said was, within each theme, there are some people that are really dissatisfied. If you can move those people up to the next level of satisfaction, this is the improvement you're going to get in the overall level of satisfaction as represented by the green box. So if you look at the end, on the right-hand side, say workplace and change management, you can see the level of improvement that you get just by focusing on the greatest degree of dissatisfaction. If, on the other hand, you can move everybody within each theme up to the highest level of satisfaction, which is obviously going to take a huge amount of work, then the blue arrow shows you the improvement that you get overall. So in the case of workplace and change management, it was interesting to see actually there's very little further improvement you could get once you dealt with the most dissatisfied people. On the other hand, in terms of communication, yes, in the short term, deal with the most dissatisfied people, you get a little improvement, but long term, there was a lot of work needed to be done, but the benefits could be very big. So that was a very interesting insight. So basically, in this particular case, the organisation was strong at top-down communication, but they were weak at bottom-up. Next slide, please, Andrew. And then I think we're at the end. This is a similar one, but this time for the inpatient survey. So for the key questions, overall, 65% of patients gave an excellent or very good rating. And what we were able to show that when you looked at the different themes, the 4 themes that mattered here, doctors and nurses, care and treatment, hospital experience, and leaving experience, of those that rated doctors and nurses as good, which is the highest level of satisfaction, 89% also said that the overall rating was excellent or very good. So they gave the highest possible rating overall. When it came to the leading experience, those that rated leading experience highly, only 53% said overall they were very good. So to us, that told us getting the leading experience right wasn't the biggest driver of overall satisfaction. It was the doctors and nurses that was the biggest satisfaction here. I'm conscious of time here, but basically what then happened is that within each theme, we then went down to question level, and a similar thing happened below. So in the case of doctors and nurses, yeah, that's right. So in case of doctors and nurses, of those that said doctors and nurses were good, for question 32, those who answered that they always trusted their doctors, 74% of patients said the doctors and nurses overall were good. So that was a way of just showing this is the key question to focus on. And if you focus on that and get everybody to agree, yes, they always trust their doctors, then the improvement that you would get in the overall rating is 6.4%, as indicated by the black boxes. So the black boxes indicate which areas to focus on in order to drive improvement overall. So I would have spent a bit more time in that, but I want to go finish off here on decisions. Really, there are two issues here with the probation staff, and we made a bit of a boo-boo here. We didn't realise that the audience for this report was the staff. The management did not want to be seen to be influencing the report. So they were very hands-off. We had a number of questions that we kept asking them. They were very slow and replied to that. And it was only later we realised that they wanted to be very hands-off in terms of how the report was written and, you know, because it was intended for the staff. So that was something we didn't quite get right. In the case of the inpatient survey, there had been prior opinion as to why the trust was not performing so well on satisfaction. And we were able to show that in the previous opinion that they had a difficult mix of demographics was actually not correct at all. It was every demographic shared similar opinions, and it was really down to the staff to drive improvement. So I think the last slide just summarises it's a summary, and I think I'm now ready to take some questions. So really what I'm asking, challenging you here is to invest more time in thinking before you carry out the survey. And go through these questions which are available and explained in a bit more detail in the associated document. You should find that if you invest some time into those answering those questions, you'll get a bit more clarity about what your needs and constraints are within each scope, and you can join that up, hopefully, and get closer to a more perfect survey. So I think we're at a point of questions now, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Nigel. So lots of insights there, lots of really good nuggets there for us to take away. I wanted to just really focus on the core message there, that if we get this stuff right, it gives us the insight, it tells us where to focus, and in doing that can really help us with the culture of our organizations. And I think that's something that we all wrestle with. So thank you for hammering that point home so so eloquently, Nigel. There's a couple of people who have asked questions. So I can see a colleague has asked a question here about knowing who it is who has and has not answered your question. So I'm going to unmute that questioner. So Melissa, I'm just going to take your mute now, and if you want to elaborate and explain more, just share that question with the group, you may, and if you don't want to speak, that's absolutely fine. We'll carry on and we'll take that question as is. Okay, we're struggling to hear you, Melissa, so I'm just going to mute you again. There's some background noise. So the question there is, this I think was in relation to the staff survey, and the question was, how would you know the reasons why staff are not responding? So some of your analysis, Nigel, suggested to you why it was that people disengaged with the survey. Could you shed some light on
Yeah.
that for us?
Yeah, we didn't know for certain, I must make that clear, but what we could see was that the questions on job role and demographics, which had the potential to identify the individual, was that as the questionnaire went on, remember it was 108 questions, the response rate fell. And then when we got to job profile and demographics, the response rate jumped down. So there was a discontinuity in the lack of people responding. There was a sudden jump up in the number of people that respond to the question. And the fact that it was sudden rather than continuous led us to believe that there was a lack of trust in terms of confidentiality. We put that forward merely as a suggestion, so we certainly couldn't prove that. But it was that sudden jump up in a reluctance of people to say, well, what kind of job they were doing and information about their demographics.
Thanks for that, Nigel. I hope, Melissa, that answers your question. Do feel free to raise your hand if you want to come in and follow up on that, or indeed ask another question on the control panel. And I think, Nigel, for me, that really sort of, it raises a question about non-respondents. So, you know, in any sample, there'll be a group of people who choose to respond and a group of people who choose not to. And part of the job of us as analysts is working out, well, how do we make sense of this data given that some people didn't respond? Can you just help us with that? What should we be thinking through in terms of making sense of that data given non-response?
Yeah, look, as I say, there's two parts of this. What you're looking for, is there a pattern to the non-response? If there is a pattern, then you need to do something about it. But if you can't find a pattern to the non-response, then you can actually exclude those people and just accept that you've got a smaller sample and it doesn't stop you from analysing further. So what do I mean by a pattern? As you know, both these kind of surveys are seeking to measure people's experiences and engagement. So it's a satisfaction, dissatisfaction scale that you're using. And what you don't want is a bias in the survey. So you don't want your survey saying, oh, everything's perfect, everything's wonderful, and that's because those people who were dissatisfied couldn't be bothered to respond. But that is an issue. If you've got that kind of bias, then you either use the statistical model of imputation, which is not easy, and it is fairly sophisticated, but it can be used to impute what people would have said. Or you're going to have to accept that you've got an imperfect survey and make a decision as to whether or not the results are going to be meaningful.
So you said something along the way, which is one of the surveys that you mentioned, the demographic questions were poorly constructed. You mentioned one bracket of that was the ethnicity, but in general, I suppose that leads us to point. We really need to know our sample, don't we? And we really need to get those questions right in order to make sense of the data. And sort of the better an idea we have of who has responded and who hasn't, the more likely we are to get good insight. Is that a good summary?
Yes. I mean, you need, well, there are two ways of doing it. First of all, having prior knowledge before you even do the survey, what is the makeup of the population that you're surveying, but that might be from the census or from some other data set. So that then, when you actually get the responses, that allows you to sample to say, well, okay, we're going to ask these people to take part in the survey, and then also within each subpopulation say, well, okay, did they respond? And if they didn't, which subpopulations were least likely to respond? And then ask the question, well, is that a problem? And it's only a problem if the lack of response induces a bias in their response. If they're just simply hard to reach, but if you do reach them, they're just as likely to respond whether satisfied or dissatisfied. That is much less of a problem than, say, the dissatisfied people not only being hard to reach, but not even bothering to respond.
Isn't that interesting? And I guess one of the things is so much of this exploratory work happens in the unknown, doesn't it? So knowing what you don't know is always is the holy grail, isn't it? So I'm just going to do a quick recap here around some of the key messages that you've told us. You've told us that a perfect survey is hard to achieve, and we all try as hard as we can to get as close to that nirvana as you described it. But there are organizational constraints, and there are operational realities, aren't there? So I guess thinking it through, using a good methodology, thinking about the different steps or arcs of the survey wheel right from the beginning is the safest way to safeguard against those pitfalls. You've told us about some of the skills that you need in your team, and you've helpfully introduced this concept of a sort of blue, red, and green areas of work or skill sets that are required. So if anyone is commissioning a survey and thinking about putting a team together, they're going to need to think about those different skill sets required at different moments and make sure that their team are able to do the task that is being asked of them. I was really taken by what you said about people being sometimes too quick to jump in and to use a questionnaire. We Captive Health, we see this quite a lot. We're a provider of quite sophisticated survey tools, so there can be an element of, well, when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Not suggesting that happens all the time, but I suppose it is disrespectful of your respondents, if nothing else. It might be statistically not very useful, but it's also disrespectful of your respondents to just go and survey for survey's sake. And it's always worth thinking through your information needs and working out what you can answer in other ways before you go into a survey. And we've seen today just how much work and thought and care needs to go into getting that exercise right and doing it properly. So you do that and resource it properly and do it with good consideration and good care. You also talked about the forced choice questions and ways of asking questions, closed questions, and keywords, and giving yourself the option to do sentiment analysis. We would endorse that fully at Captive Health, and we've built code frames on the back of our system to enable people to really get good value out of the data that they collate using survey mechanisms. And I think there's a reality there as well, which is understanding what the purpose of the exercise is. If we're just doing regular tracking and we're building performance indicators to monitor over time, you'd be using those questions, constructed questions, completely differently to if you're doing a benchmarking survey or a one-off results method or a piece of research which is completely exploratory. So lots and lots of considerations there, and some of that is explored more fully in the paper, which is available on our website or is available as handouts right now. We've also talked about survey fatigue and using best practice, breaking down the surveys into bite-sized chunks and applying batteries of questions differently to different audiences. That's also a really good technique to use when you're thinking about that problem of understanding who has responded and when, because obviously if you do that well, your survey is well tagged and well classified, and it helps your when it comes to the insight part and reporting part, it helps you get that bit right. And I suppose most of all, what you've told us is if we get this stuff right, we do the analysis well, and we've got a well-constructed exercise, it'll tell us where to focus and where to focus our precious management time and precious resource as busy and overstretched organisations. So Nigel, thank you. There are a few more questions that are just coming through. One of them here is around examples, if we can share some examples of surveys designed to meet particular objectives and those designed to meet more objectives and what that would look like. Nigel, do you know of a good bank or a good sort of training resource on this?
With the training on identifying objectives.
And questionnaire design, yeah. Is there a really good sort of go-to place for picking up some of those examples?
Yes, I mean the Royal Statistical Society runs a couple of courses on questionnaire design and survey design. So if you have a look at the Royal Statistical Society's website, rss.org.uk, there's a good questionnaire design course, which I've been on myself. On Objective, interestingly enough, there is an event that's taking place in Manchester University towards the end of this month, I believe. Now, I'm just checking my email. I've lost the details, but it was focused on how to identify objectives. So someone up in Manchester University is running one in a few weeks' time on how to identify research objectives, and I took a look at it, and I thought it was a little bit simple for my needs, but it might have to be a good course then for other people interested.
Fantastic, thank you for that. So there's resources out there, and there's no substitute for spending a bit of time like we have today, but taking a step out of the office and really doing that properly. And I have to say, I've known Nigel for over a decade now, and we've worked together on many projects, including one of the ones that was an example here today. Nigel is an absolutely fantastic facilitator and trainer. So if you think about doing any of this in your own organisations, he would be glad to hear from you, I'm sure. We've got one more question here on the control panel, which is about the key driver analysis and asking for further information. Now, I know that piece of work very, very well, so I'll come back to you specifically on that offline, because that was a piece of work that Nigel and I did together. And if you had further questions about that, do please get in touch with me at Captive Health, or indeed Nigel directly, and we will help you with any questions that this has sparked for you. That just leaves me to say thank you to Nigel, who technology is a wonderful thing. Nigel's joined us from the USA today, and he's over on the other side of the Atlantic. I think this has worked very, very well indeed. We've got people dotted all over the country here around the NHS, around healthcare, who have joined us from their desks today. So this has been a really good session. I just want to say a huge thank you to Nigel, and an open invitation to everybody around the table today to get in touch and stay in touch with us, Captive Health, and see the sorts of things that we're doing with new technologies in this space. Thank you very much indeed, and have a good rest of lunch break, everybody.